Brain equal to the mind equal to the brain. Is there a relationship between mind and brain? Are they same? Are they different? What are they? Let's explore in this video what is the relationship between brain and the mind. In order to get into that, let's understand the mind in the most simple form and also look at the structure of the brain in a very basic format. Starting with the mind. What is the mind? We can simplify it saying that whatever we experience is one part of the mind, meaning we are receiving sensory inputs like we are seeing things, we are listening to sounds, we are also touching, tasting, smelling things. All these sensory inputs are experienced. So, one aspect of the mind is experiencing things around the environment and also experiencing the body. So, experiencing the mental faculties or mental aspects, sensory inputs, and the body. When I say experiencing the mental aspects, it's the feeling that we have in a mind. Similarly, we have expressions. That means we have some actions. We move our body with our mind. We intend to move our hands or walk or dance or write. All these things are intentions of the mind, which are actions translated in the body. And that's what we say action in the body. And also, there are some mental actions like thinking, goal setting, planning, organizing. There are multiple ways of internal reflections or self reflection. All these things are mental actions. So there are physical actions and mental actions. There are physical experience and mental experience. Let's put together these all things as the mind for simplification. Now moving on to the structure of the brain. When we're looking at the structure of the brain, if you see a picture somewhere, you'll find towards the bottom part of the brain, there'll be kind of a stem known as the brain stem. It connects the spinal cord to the brain. So that part is the bottom and lowest part of the brain. And behind that, an organ which is known as the cerebellum. So brainstem and cerebellum. Above that, there is a larger structure which we normally see it as the brain, which is a wavy, cauliflower-like, rounded shaped organ, which is known as the cerebrum. So cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. This much let's understand. But our concern today is about the cerebrum because that is primarily the part which mediates the mind. Now let's see how we can map the brain onto different aspects of mind. Now when we look at the brain structure, the cerebrum, the top part of the cerebrum is known as the cerebral cortex. Cortex would mean the skin or the bark of the tree, somewhat wavy. There are some peaks and some ridges or some kind of valleys, and those are the areas which are primarily coordinating a lot with the mind, or they are giving us the experience and expression of our body and mind. When we are looking at the top part of the brain or the cerebrum, we can see there are certain structural issues. When I say structural issues, if you look little minutely, you would find there is a division at the center. Along the center, longitudinally, there is a division, as if there is a groove out there. And this is known as the longitudinal fissure. Fissure would mean a trench. So it is dividing the brain into two halves. So there are two parts, left part and the right part of the brain, known as the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. They seem very similar, identical, but functionally there is a lot of difference. One major difference that we observe is right part of the brain, the right hemisphere, controls and organizes and help in experiencing the left side of the body. Similarly, the left part of the brain, the left hemisphere, controls, organizes, and does the action in the right side of the body. Left part controls the right part controls the left side of the body. We'll see not just along the center, there are other little divisions in the brain. And broadly, we can divide them based on the grooves which are there. We divide the cortex into 4 parts. So the frontal part is known as the frontal lobe. The middle part is known as the parietal lobe, and they are separated by the central sulcus. So front of the central sulcus, or the anterior part as they term it technically, the anterior part is known as the frontal lobe, and the posterior, the backward part, is the parietal lobe of the central sulcus. Similarly, there is another part known as the temporal lobe. So there is temporal lobe here, which is again separated by another ridge. And the fourth part is the occipital lobe at the backside of the brain. So four parts, but when we see there are two hemispheres, so there will be 8 parts: frontal left and right, parietal left and right, occipital left and right, and temporal left and right side. Now, understanding this much, we'll go further to see what each of these lobes are doing for us. How are they giving us the experience and also enabling us to act in the body and mind? So, experiencing body mind and acting in body mind is what the mind. Broadly, we understood that much as we started. Now, going to the same and plotting them onto the structure of the brain, starting with the occipital lobe, which is on the back side. So when we look at the back side, it is just against our eyes, kind of a screen out there. So easy to remember, the occipital lobe gives us the sensory experiences. Whatever we see through visual inputs, through our sensory nerves, they are experienced with the help of the occipital lobe. Let's understand one more thing here, and this is applicable to all other senses. When we are receiving and experiencing any sensory input, it is processed at the primary sensory cortex. Primary sensory cortex means at a very basic level, we receive some input and process them. But that's not enough. We have to have multiple layer and more sophisticated processing. And here I would give you a very simple example to help you appreciate what exactly is this sophisticated processing for experience, higher level experiences. There is one neural disorder known as prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia, complicated term. Simple term is face blindness. Some people, they have all other visual inputs or visual experiences in order, but they cannot experience or they cannot recognize faces. That's why it is called the face blindness or prosopagnosia, the technical term. Now, what happens here? There is a part called the fusiform gyrus. That part helps us recognize faces. If I look at a face, I recognize. And in face blindness, it's such a complicated thing. The person even cannot recognize his own face in the mirror, neither face of his close relatives or his or her acquaintances. So, see the complications. If the associated areas are not proper, we will be losing out a lot of information, the processing would not happen, and we may not experience something regarding vision, even if we are receiving all inputs and getting the primary colors, we are getting the shapes and sizes, but you will not be able to have the experience at a higher order. Visual association cortex help us recognize higher order visual experiences, like giving a meaning. If I see my mother, I have a meaning for that particular visual input. If I see some very important person, let's say a celebrity, I give meaning to that. So these higher order experiences of vision are given at the association or visual association cortex. As I say, the face recognition is a little higher order processing which gives us the experience of a face. Similarly, for each of the senses, we have a primary and there is an association or a supplementary cortex for higher order experience. Now, we understood the occipital lobe gives us the visual input and the related experience of vision. Moving on to the auditory input. And yes, you guessed it right. Because the temporal lobe is around our ears, the auditory inputs are primarily processed in the temporal lobes. Again, as we discussed, there are primary areas and there are association cortex. So the upper part is the primary area, then below that, the association cortices are there. Cortices is the plural of cortex. So that part helps us understanding, experiencing sound. And there is a very important part called the Wernicke's area, and it is typically on the left side. And that helps us appreciating the meaning of the words that we listen to, the meanings of the sentences that we hear from others. Even when we are speaking, the meaning aspect of a sentence is modulated and mediated by the Wernicke's area. Usually it is in the left temporal lobe. One more thing we can see from the left right division. Mostly you'll find the left side of the brain is for logical interpretation of things, for comprehending things. Whereas on the right side of the brain, we are more in artistic, more openness, and more connectedness aspects are processed on the right side. So when we are listening to a music or a song, the interpretation of the language of the song, the beauty of the poetry is interpreted in the left temporal lobe, whereas the tune, the musical flow is usually interpreted in the right temporal lobe. So this is about sound. So two things we have now understood. Visual inputs, experiences around the occipital lobe primarily, and auditory inputs on the temporal lobes. Now moving on to the next aspects, the touch aspect and the bodily feeling aspects. It's known as the somatosensory aspect. And this happens in the parietal lobe, where close to the central sulcus, dividing the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, just behind the central sulcus is a strip which helps us in having experience of touch, experience of the body, pain, temperature, pressure, all these things which help us give a sense of being embodied and getting a sense of how we are flowing through a three-dimensional space where our body is moving. All this aspect is governed by the somatosensory cortex, which is just next to the border, which is the central sulcus. That part is called the somatosensory cortex. Now, one more interesting thing that we'll notice here. When we say the left side of the brain is controlling the right side of the body, and we can also see which part of that somatosensory cortex is affecting or is experiencing which part. When we go to the medial part, to the top of the somatosensory cortex, that part is actually representing the toes. And slowly as we move downward, we will move upward in the body. That means the mid part is the toes. Then as we move little upward, legs, the trunk, hands. So as we move from the center towards the lateral part, towards the downward part, we start from the toes and slowly we move towards the lateral, more towards the ear, and at the lowest part we are having the experience of the facial muscles and the facial skin. So the mapping is from bottom towards the top as we move from the medial to the lateral part of the somatosensory cortex. Right toes somewhere here, the right face somewhere here. Similarly, the left toes somewhere here, and slowly as we move downward, we experience the right side of the face. So this is, in simple term, how we are experiencing the somatosensory aspects of our body, like pain, pressure, some movement, some touch, somebody is touching or we are touching something. All those experiences of touch and bodily feelings are mapped on the somatosensory cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex. But it has to have a associated cortex, which will give us more sophisticated experience. Also, the associated cortex help in forming new memories. That means if I touch something and I have a feeling of this is an apple, that touch memory also needs to be created in the body. It also has to check past memories. If I'm touching something, closing my eyes, okay, this is shape of a bottle and this may be a steel bottle. So that kind of sense will come when I check with past memories, and it happens in the association cortex, which is just next to the primary cortex. So the somatosensory association cortex is little towards the backward or posterior part of the parietal lobe. Now we move on to the next part, where the taste and smell sensations are there. Again, we have to go back to the temporal lobe. For the taste sensations, it's somewhere inside. In fact, the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, the border is known as the lateral sulcus. If you look at or move deep into the lateral sulcus, rip open the border and go inside, there is a very important part known as insula, which mediates our taste sensations to a large extent. Similarly, deep inside the temporal lobe at the medial area, when you move inside, we find a location where the olfactory or the smell sensations, both primary and associations, are processed. Now we are moving towards the action part. Now, as we move towards the frontal lobe, remember the central sulcus, which is the border of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Just next to the border, that means it is close to the somatosensory primary cortex or the primary somatosensory cortex, is the primary motor cortex. What motor means? Actions of our hands, legs, movement of our or the voice, whatever we are doing which is action in the body is governed by the motor cortex. Again, very similar to the mapping of the somatosensory cortex, the motor cortex also has a mapping. That means when we start from the medial part of the motor cortex, we will see that on the left side, it starts from the toes, and as we move downward, it moves upward and very close, or that the lateral part, lowest part, you'll find all those facial muscle movements are mediated. So the motor cortex helps moving the body. If the motor cortex are damaged, then we will have paralytic attacks. We'll not be able to move in a coordinated manner our body. If the left side of the motor cortex is damaged, the right side of the body will be paralyzed and vice versa. Now again, for the motor cortex, we also have got a supplementary area. Why is it required? Motor cortex, primary motor cortex would help us in primary movements. But as we move more further, there are more sophisticated coordinated aspects are performed at the supplementary area. Now, moving towards the most frontal part of the frontal lobe, prefrontal lobe area, which is the seat of mental actions. Mind is about physical and mental experiences and physical and mental actions. So we talked about the physical action in the frontal lobe, and now we are talking about the mental actions like thought, goal setting, planning, execution, organizing things, speech. Many of such things are organized and coordinated in the frontal part. Especially there is a part called the Broca's area, and this part, it's close to the temporal lobe as well, and the left side of your frontal lobe, which helps us coordinating our speech and activating those muscles which help us expressing speech. Not just that, it also coordinates, organizes, or what we call the syntax aspect of the language, giving language a structure, the grammar aspect of the language, you can loosely call it. So that also happens in the Broca's area, which is on the left side of the frontal lobe. Left prefrontal area, you'll find the Broca's area is there, which is very important from speech point of view. So if you now see what we have understood as of now, we have understood that mind is something like experiencing the physical and the psychological aspects, and also action of the physical and the mental aspects. And when we are plotting it onto the brain, we see there are 4 different parts on the cortex, or on the top part of the brain, cerebral cortex as we call it. We can see what is happening where. The visual sensations are experienced in the occipital lobe, which is on the back side. The auditory sensations or sound aspects are processed in the temporal area. The somatosensory, that means touch and our experience of the body, that happens in the parietal lobe. And The action aspects are happening in the frontal lobe. So, this is what we have understood so far. Now, coming to what we call experiencing the mind or the feelings, or what we term as the emotions. Where are they processed? They are processed at a place which is deep inside, which is known as the limbic system. And this is again a very deep, and it has to be detailed. That's why I have created a separate video on limbic system and how it processes emotion. So please check out to understand how we experience our mind. If you're liking and loving the content that we're sharing about the brain and the mind, do consider subscribing to the channel so that you can understand more and more aspects of the brain, mind, and life as such. And also do like and share with others.